who's with us today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind everybody that June 6th today is a day that is in world history. It's the 73rd anniversary of the D-Day landings in Europe. With me today is a gentleman who is a World War II veteran, a hero, and a survivor of the Battle of the Bulge. In June of 1942, Mr. Reifsnyder received greetings from the President Franklin Roosevelt. His greetings was a draft notice. He was drafted in the U.S. Army on July 2nd, 1942. He served with the 3rd Battalion, 319th Infantry Regiment, 80th Division, which was also known as the Blue Ridge Division. He became Staff Sergeant, serving as the Radio Communications Section Chief. On July 2nd, 1944, he and many other soldiers boarded the Queen Mary, which transported them to Scotland. Then they were moved to Manchester, England. They then crossed the English Channel in a ferry and landed on Normandy Beach. Now, this was just prior to the invasion of Normandy Beach. His section's duty was to secure local cities that the Germans had occupied and had their first encounter with the German army in a town called Saint-Michel, France, on September 6, 1944. Mr. Reifsnyder is also responsible for setting up and maintaining communications from battalion headquarters with regimental headquarters, and eventually with General Patton of the 3rd Army. Now, this was an extremely important part of the war to relay movements of Allied forces and German troops. On December 18, 1944, his division was moved during the night to Luxembourg. On December 19th, the very fierce Battle of the Bulge began, and he was right in the middle of the battle. During the battle, an artillery shell was launched and fell at the foot of a Jeep that he and his team were riding in, causing the tires to be literally blown off the Jeep. Fortunately, no soldiers were injured. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, a small force of U.S. soldiers repelled an attack by the German army. Mr. Reifsnyder played a very important part in this battle. While under attack with bombs going off, mortar shells falling, bullets flying through the air, he contacted the U.S. Artillery Division to fire on the enemy by giving them their position. With artillery shells coming right in front of them, an overhead burst of artillery explosions stopped the attack and caused the enemy to withdraw. The biggest threat to radio men and communication soldiers was sniper fire, booby traps, artillery shells, and mortar shells, all of which they constantly encountered while maintaining vital communications with Army headquarters on the movements of the enemy. And you know, the enemy always booby-trapped their positions when they retreated, knowing that U.S. soldiers would be hurt or killed when these traps exploded. Eventually, the war ended after U.S. troops crossed the Rhine River and the Germans surrendered. Mr. Reifsnyder saw the concentration camps. He saw many traps set by the Germans to kill Allied forces. He was engaged in fierce battles and saw many of his fellow soldiers give the ultimate sacrifice. He especially remembers some of the soldiers from Berks County who also served. Some returned home, some did not. Being a communications chief, he had to relay messages from General Patton to the battalion, such as cross the Our River at all costs. At all costs bothered him. It was a message that he knew he had to deliver, and he did, because he knew it was a vital part of the battle for the United States Army to win. To his great credit, Mr. Reifsnyder received the Bronze Star, the Combat Infantry Badge, the 4th Theater Battle Stars for serving in France, Luxembourg, Central Germany, and Austria, and many other medals and ribbons and badges, which I had the privilege of seeing. Mr. Reifsnyder pointed out to me that during the war in Europe, the enemy had better weapons. They had burp guns, they had jet engines, rockets, and bigger tanks. Even though the U.S. had smaller tanks, the U.S. was able to produce more of them, allowing the Allied forces to have tanks in more places and fight the enemy. Having served with distinction throughout his military career, he endured countless hardships and made untold sacrifices, placed himself in harm's way to defend, protect the cause of freedom. And his conduct, performance, and devotion to duty reflected his allegiance to the highest standards of military service. During my interview with Mr. Reifsnyder, he said, "It was a privilege, and I am very proud to serve in the United States Army to defend our country and its allies." I just want to repeat that. It's a privilege, and I'm very proud to serve in the United States Army to defend our country and its allies. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you one of the heroes of the Battle of the Bulge, 95-year-old Mr. Norman Reifsnyder, and his son with him, Peter Reifsnyder. Would you please stand?
Thank you, Representative.